He claims he deplores segregation and racial prejudice, yet he does not support forced non segregation or fair employment practices for that matter. He is consistently against government regulation, so he's at least predictable, however wrong. Hi, I'm Megan Myth, and I talk about politics, education, parental responsibility, and my opinion on all of those things. Curiosity and critical thinking are imperative. Asking why is a good thing. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. It's an easy and free way to support this channel. Also, if you'd like to support me directly, there's a Buy Me a Coffee link in the description box below. Let's get into the video. Welcome to my sidebar series. This is where I talk about things that are background or related to things like Project 2025. I'll be going over Milton Friedman's 1955 essay titled The Role of Government in Education. This is going to be more of an overview. I won't be going through it page by page, but I will read some of it here and there. There's a link to the full essay in the description box below if you'd like to read it for yourself. I'm going over this essay because it is the basis of the education philosophy in Project 2025. It's referred to on page 319, and it's why they are dismantling the Department of Education. Milton Friedman was a Nobel Prize-winning American economist and statistician. He was born in 1912 and died in 2006. A lot of his work challenged Keynesian economics. He was an advisor to President Ronald Reagan, and we know how much the Heritage Foundation loves Ronald Reagan. Just because Friedman won a Nobel Prize, it does not mean that Friedman's economic theories are a positive influence on society. I think this essay, if put into practice, would do more harm than good. We'll get into the why in a second. I'm going to try and explain my understanding of his work. Please forgive me if I get anything wrong. I'm not an economist. From what I gather, Friedman believed that the economy functioned best as an absolute free market with no intervention, except in specific circumstances, which he mentions in this essay. Let's get into the essay itself. Keeping what I just mentioned in mind when looking at his theories and suggestions, Friedman assumes that society is organized around the idea of family being the ultimate objective. He has this in common with Project 2025, which seeks to place the family above all else in society. In general, Friedman advocates strongly for free markets and only gives 3 justifications for government intervention: monopolies, substantial neighborhood effects, and an ambiguous paternalistic concern for children and other irresponsible individuals. He admits he has no answer to this last one, but he clarifies this by saying the belief in freedom is for responsible units, among whom we include neither children nor insane people. Keep in mind, this was written in 1955. This was when insane asylums were still around, though the movement of deinstitutionalization was beginning as well. The fact that he refers to people as units is the beginning of his hyper-utilitarianism, in my opinion. My other issue with this is that using the word insane, as we now know, is complicated. Who gets to decide insanity? Minnesota is trying to make someone disagreeing with Trump a mental illness. Personally, I will leave the definition of insane to the mental health professionals and not lawmakers who were arrested and charged with soliciting a minor for prostitution. Friedman then attempts to apply these economic ideas to education. He breaks this essay down into 2 parts: general education for citizenship and specialized vocational education. First, we'll talk about the section on general education for citizenship. Friedman's main argument is about government administration versus government funding of education. He doesn't seem to have as much of an issue with the government funding education within certain limits. He starts out by saying, a stable and democratic society is impossible without widespread acceptance of some common set of values and without a minimum degree of literacy and knowledge on the part of most citizens. Notice the word most there, not all. I agree that society needs a minimum amount of literacy and knowledge to function. People need to be able to read in order to know what street signs say. People need to know how to read numbers to know what the prices are at the grocery store. However, these are extremely basic examples that don't account for the social aspect of a smoothly functioning society. Friedman acknowledges that education contributes to other people's welfare by promoting a stable and democratic society, otherwise known as the neighborhood effect. And this is the point where my opinion sharply diverges from Friedman's when it comes to the value of education. I think that promoting a stable and democratic society is just the beginning of the value of education. Friedman asserts that education is only for increasing the economic productivity of a person. Let's get back to the neighborhood effect. As I mentioned earlier, Friedman believes that a significant neighborhood effect is one of the justifications of government intervention. In this case, he suggests that the government require that each child receive a minimum amount of education of a specified kind. He never really gets into what specified kind really means, but later he suggests that the minimum standard of education should be left up to each community. The problem with leaving it up to each community is that the minimum standards will be wildly different across the country. In the context of Project 2025, we can assume that community correlates to state. Does it mean that children will learn to read and write and basic math and that's it? Does it mean they will learn about European history? Does it mean they will learn higher math or science? Does that mean that art classes will or won't exist? Does it mean that children will learn about a skewed version of Christianity if Christian nationalism takes hold in the federal government? Friedman asserts that just because government is currently administrating education doesn't mean it has to be that way, and that someone should question it. He says the desirability of such nationalization has seldom been faced explicitly because governments have, in the main, financed education by paying directly the costs of running educational institutions, so that this step has seemed required by the decision to subsidize education. He seems to be disregarding the fact that the government has been involved in American education since the beginning, even in the New England colonies. There has been support for public schools all along. That's not to say people didn't use private tutors or private schools. Many people did. But public school is not a new idea. Early colonial communities saw the value in education and wanted it for everyone. Early education in the United States didn't have a common set of curricula. Instead, all of the schools were run independently, much like Friedman argues for. But there's a reason the government got involved in school administration. The independent school system needed improvements. The grade system we use today, K through 12, separated by age, wasn't established until the 1800s. Ironically, the person leading the Common Curricular charge, Horace Mann, argued that universal public education was the best way to raise up Republican citizens. In this context, Republican refers to the core value of a citizen of a republic, not the Republican Party. It wasn't until 1930 that completing elementary school was a requirement for all students across the United States. That's less than 100 years ago. Compulsory attendance had been the norm in Massachusetts, for example, since 1852. This illustrates the fact that even in 1930, there were still states that did not require children to attend school. Education, in general, has a positive neighborhood effect because education is not only good for the individual, but it's also good for others in the individual's orbit or their neighborhood. It's another way of saying it has an overall positive effect on a community when people within that community participate in education. Primary and secondary education, or K through 12 in particular, teaches not only knowledge, but also critical social skills that children will use for the rest of their lifetimes. It's an extremely important time during a child's development. It's when children start to navigate friendships, learn how to communicate with their teachers, and most importantly, they start to learn how to learn. At this point in his essay, Friedman suggests vouchers. This is a bit long, so bear with me. He says governments could require a minimum level of education which they could finance by giving parents vouchers redeemable for a specified maximum sum per child per year if spent on approved educational services. Parents would then be free to spend this sum and any additional sum on purchasing educational services from an approved institution of their own choice. The educational services could be rendered by private enterprises operated for profit or by nonprofit institutions of various kinds. The role of the government would be limited to assuring that the schools met certain minimum standards, such as the inclusion of a minimum common content in their programs, much as it now inspects restaurants to assure that they maintain minimum sanitary standards. Friedman uses an example of government regulation of sanitary standards to illustrate how it would enforce school regulation. However, the current regime is aiming to deregulate just about everything they can. Going back to education, who would approve these approved programs? The federal government, the state, the local school board. The current regime is railing against conditions being placed upon school funding, but this is exactly that. It's hard to argue for freedom of choice when that freedom has to be approved. As far as the voucher effects on students go, a 2016 article from NPR explains that school voucher students perform about the same as non voucher students. There's evidence for both positive and negative effects on students, so it's a mixed bag as to whether it's better for students or not. There's some evidence that it reduced racial segregation based on the program in Louisiana. I could see that happening if parents send their child to a school that isn't in their neighborhood, since neighborhoods are often racially segregated. I could also see this working if these vouchers were given only to low income families. However, the plan is to give them to everyone. If the Department of Education goes away, who's going to administer and monitor these vouchers? Project 2025 proposes moving certain funding to other departments for federal children, like those who live in Washington, D.C., members of First Nations, or children of military families. This funding would be put into smaller educational divisions within their respective agencies. This would potentially allow the federal government to, say, overfund military children's educations and underfund DC or First Nation children educations. And it could be blamed on the lack of funding in that department. There's risk there. I'm also curious to know how the voucher purchases would be verified. ESAs are referenced in Project 2025 as a method of funding these school vouchers. Currently, education savings plans, or ESAs, have the following conditions. I pulled these from Schwab's website. Qualified education expenses can include tuition, fees, books, supplies, equipment, and room and board, certain costs associated with K through 12 tuition, participation in a registered apprenticeship program, or payment of a qualified education loan up to $10,000 may also be considered qualified educational expenses. The availability of tax or other benefits may be conditioned on meeting certain requirements, such as residency, purpose for or timing of distribution, or other factors. Purchases that don't qualify under these conditions are taxed at higher rates. But what exactly are supplies and equipment? For K through 12 students, this could be interpreted as things like pasta or a new iPad even. The potential for fraud and abuse of this system is high. There's also the problem of child abuse. It's a tough subject, but we have to think about how abusive parents will defraud the system for their own gain. They could purchase a new iPad and claim it was a learning tool for their child when they're the one really using it. They could claim food purchases for themselves and claim it was for their child's art project or science experiment. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Being a parent does not qualify someone to determine educational standards. The unschooling movement is the perfect example of this. Going back to the essay, Friedman concedes that this lack of common core of values is a problem that cannot really be overcome with school vouchers. Instead, he takes a hard left turn into freedom. Friedman claims that forcing children into a standardized school curriculum like we have now is akin to indoctrination and inhibits freedom of thought. He also says that parents can express their support or disdain for a school's programs by choosing to enroll or not enroll their child. And in theory, schools matching those values will spring up to meet those needs. He treats it like capitalism, supply and demand. This is an extreme take, in my opinion. The difference that I'm seeing here is between knowledge and learning. I may not get these definitions exactly right, so just know this is my own opinion on the subject. Knowledge is what you know. This can be facts, figures, historical dates, things you remember and can regurgitate later. Learning is the act of processing knowledge, but you can also learn how to learn. It's an extremely valuable skill. This gives you the ability to keep learning throughout your lifetime, even after you've finished school. Granted, it is like a muscle that you have to keep working in order not to lose. So you can't say, I've learned all I need to know, I'm done, and expect to keep growing as a person over time. But my point is, if you learn how to learn, you can't inherently inhibit freedom of thought. Because if you learn how to learn, you can apply that skill to anything, regardless of whether or not it's in school. This is also a reason why libraries are so valuable. It gives everyone access to learning resources even after their time in school is complete. Friedman recognizes the argument that giving parents the power of school choice would exacerbate class distinctions, but he dismisses the idea by saying whether or not this argument is valid in principle, it is not at all clear that the stated results would follow. Given that we have the advantage of time since this essay was written, we can, in my opinion, see that yes, it would exacerbate class distinctions. This is apparent with the rise of prestigious and exclusive private schools, both K through 12 and universities. We can see this because the class divide has already widened over time since 1955, and the wealthy class has generally isolated themselves from the rest of society with their monetary resources. I think most of us can recognize that the ultra wealthy live very different lives than the rest of us. Friedman also acknowledges that in some areas there may not be enough children to support more than one school, but he glosses over it a bit by reason of transportation and population growth. He also mentions the option of a mixed school approach, some administered by the government and others available via voucher. This is similar to the system we have now, except the voucher would give parents more options of private schools. One of the problems Friedman doesn't mention in his essay is the privatization of schools and increasing tuition. We've already seen part of this with rapidly rising university tuition costs. If schools do not have a mandate to accept all students or keep tuition within the voucher cost, private schools could start operating as for profit schools, meaning schools could potentially have shareholders they are beholden to, rather than serving students. I'm scared to think of what that would look like. There's also the problem of inflation. The federal government has a history of not raising the minimum wage to keep up with inflation. What's to keep them from doing this with vouchers too? What if voucher values remain the same for 20 years and school tuitions become higher than the voucher value? Low income families cannot make up for the extra cost in the same way that higher income families can. This would effectively gatekeep education to only wealthy families. The voucher students would be left with the leftover scraps, whatever they may be. Something else I want to note is about resources. If a family chooses to homeschool their child or children, which may become more commonplace if families are receiving direct funding, those children lose access to a guidance counselor who is not only a mandated reporter, but someone that can provide resources that children cannot get at home. If more parents choose to homeschool, the likelihood of children experiencing abuse without outside resources will increase. I'm not saying all homeschoolers are abused. What I am saying is that the combination of direct funding via vouchers combined with the rise of Christian nationalism can lead to more situations where children are abused and religiously indoctrinated at home in an isolated environment. It's a risk we need to be aware of. In the footnotes, Friedman goes into detail about school choice with a severe libertarian slant. He claims he deplores segregation and racial prejudice, yet he does not support forced non segregation or fair employment practices for that matter. He is consistently against government regulation, so he's at least predictable, however wrong. This is another problem I noticed. Getting rid of protected classes would allow schools to discriminate against students who want to attend. Friedman is making this argument as though the schools will inherently accept any student that applies, but if schools are privatized or deregulated, even, what prevents them from having a set of criteria that each student needs to meet in order to attend? Not succeed, attend. One of the things that Friedman seems to fixate on is the idea that the government currently pays for more than the minimum required education. This is where I heartily disagree with him on how we think of education, which I touched on earlier. I think of education as a necessity. It is required for a society to move forward both technologically and socially. Friedman seems to think of education as a means to an end. What is the minimum required education to meet a specific goal? It can be that, but it can also be so much more than that, too. I believe education should be a right, and not only available to people who have access to money. It should be available to everyone, and not at the expense of loan payments for life. Friedman is more inclined to justify university subsidies than vocational school subsidies because university contributes to the qualities of citizenship and community leadership. The next major section that Friedman talks about is vocational or professional education. In other words, higher education or trade schools. This is where the hyper utilitarian perspective becomes more clear. He says vocational or professional education has no neighborhood effects of the kind attributed to general education. It is a form of investment in human capital precisely analogous to investment in machinery, buildings, or other forms of non human capital. Its function is to raise the economic productivity of the human being. He goes on to explain how this economic idea applies because students forego their income in order to pay for a degree, which then allows them to receive an increased income to cover the cost of education and increase income overall. He expects a direct value arising from investment in a university degree. However, as a millennial, I have personally seen the fallacy of this idea. Today, a university degree does not equal guaranteed increased income. It doesn't even equal a return on investment, which is the cost of the degree itself. Degree being the cost of room and board, tuition, food, etc. Because the cost of university degrees is enormously high, while salaries are incredibly low. This makes getting ahead nigh on impossible, especially if fresh graduates are saddled with tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes more, of debt before they even begin their careers. Friedman then goes on to compare education to owning a building or a car and says that it's harder to pay the cost of education because you cannot sell off part of it like you can units in a building. This comparison is weird to me because education is also an effort you put into yourself, particularly higher education, to show that you value yourself and your abilities. Education is not something you own. You can change and challenge your own beliefs when you learn something new. You can solidify beliefs you already had, and you can gain wisdom with your new knowledge. In my personal opinion, I like to think of intelligence as having the wisdom to use the knowledge you have to its fullest extent. You can have knowledge and lack wisdom. Education, as a concept and an institution, is now getting villainized, which is a scary and dangerous thing, in my opinion. A lot of the arguments I've heard are things along the lines of higher education brainwashes you, you're an elitist, you're a stupid liberal, etc. Part of my family happens to be MAGA supporters, and I've heard a lot of this from them. I was the first person in that part of my family to get a 4-year degree, let alone a master's degree, yet I was somehow the bad guy. Anyway, what I'm trying to get at is that when you go through public school, private school, trade school, college, etc., you are surrounded by people during that time. Those people may think the same way as you, they may not. And it's this social experience, curiosity, and learning that makes the education system about more than just knowledge. Knowledge is very important too, don't get me wrong, but education is much more than just owning a car. I disagree that higher education doesn't have a neighborhood effect. I believe it does. You learn a lot of things in higher education, including how to interact with people who are different than you. This is less likely to happen when you are in primary and secondary school when everyone comes from the same community. Also, higher education presents an opportunity to emotionally mature to a higher degree than secondary school, considering students are older than secondary students. And you are learning how to interact with the rest of the world, not just your family and friends, by doing things like paying bills, paying rent, working, etc. Also, this reasoning reduces getting an education down to dollars and dollars only. Friedman doesn't have any compassion for the human being whatsoever. There is something to be said about enjoying your life, to having a specific interest, spending time with friends and family, or doing things that bring you joy. You don't need to work a job you hate. You can do it, but you don't need to. You are allowed to search for a job that you don't mind doing. You don't have to love it, but you don't have to hate it either. Just don't forget to pick up a hobby or two for yourself. You are not your job. At least that's how I see it. I think it's unhealthy to have your identity wrapped up in your job. If anything goes wrong with your job, it can really mess you up. Friedman continues to compare human education to buildings and physical assets. He argues that the reason we invest in education is because at the time of writing the essay, the return on investment in education was higher than investing in physical capital. He goes on to say, investment in human beings cannot be financed on the same terms or with the same ease of investment in physical capital. It is easy to see why there would be such a difference. If a fixed money loan is made to finance investment in physical capital, the lender can get some security for his loan in the form of a mortgage or residual claim to the physical asset itself, and he can count on realizing at least part of his investment in case of necessity by selling the physical asset. If he makes a comparable loan to increase the earning power of a human being, he clearly cannot get any comparable security. In a non-slave state, the individual embodying the investment cannot be bought and sold. But even if he could, the security would not be comparable. The productivity of the physical capital does not, or at least generally does not, depend on the cooperativeness of the original borrower. It's dehumanizing to think of my own value as equivalent to a building that someone owns. Friedman even goes as far as talking about investment in human capital the same way venture capital firms invest in businesses. But then he does admit that that would be akin to slavery. Here's what he says. The counterpart for education would be to buy a share in an individual's earning prospects, to advance him the funds needed to finance his training on condition that he agree to pay the lender a specified fraction of his future earnings. In this way, a lender would get back more than his initial investment from relatively successful individuals, which would compensate for the failure to recoup his original investment from the unsuccessful. There seems no legal obstacle to private contracts of this kind, even though they are economically equivalent to the purchase of a share in an individual's earning capacity and thus partial to slavery. While we may not have contracts that financially yoke one person to an investor, I could argue that most college students are under another form of yoke: student loans. Student loans hinder new graduates' ability to save money because they are paying any extra money they might make to the loans. With the current regime rolling back income-driven repayment plans, which I believe they have reinstated due to public outcry, they are dehumanizing student borrowers by demanding they pay back their loans at high monthly payment rates, regardless of their actual ability to pay. Despite their message of fixing the economy, forcing fresh college graduates to pay high monthly payments hinders their ability to contribute to said economy or do things like pay rent. Especially when compound interest is important to saving money early, taking away people's ability to save money early in their careers hurts them in the future when they are ready for retirement, making them more reliant on programs like Social Security, which, at the time of filming, is at risk of being shut down. On top of this, Friedman posits that if the government does administer student loans or investment, the government should profit from said loans by making one of the loan conditions a payback percentage of future income, meaning freshly graduated students would then be paying the government a fixed percentage of their income for an undetermined amount of time in order for the government to self finance or profit from the loan scheme. Everything about this is only about making money. The government is not a business. It does not exist to make money. It does not exist to make a profit. It exists so we can function as a society on a daily basis. It exists so we can make laws. It exists to govern. If the country has a surplus of money, that's great. But the purpose of the government is to govern, not profit. Now that we know what Project 2025 is inspired by, it gives us more insight into how it views education as a whole. It's about hyper utilitarian education without regard for the human condition. Also, I want to point out that the children in 1955 and thereabouts are the parents of millennials, aka boomers. They fed us, myself included, the lie that college is a requirement for a good life and to get a degree at any cost. We're now paying for it. Thank you for choosing to spend time with me here. You can find links to my sources as well as my Buy Me a Coffee link in the description box below. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe. You can click the bell to get notifications whenever I upload new videos. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I hope to see you again soon, and don't forget that asking why is a good thing.